Hey everyone, I'm Waylon Brinck, Technical Art Director at Naughty Dog.
And I'm Stephen Tang, technical artist at Naughty Dog.
At Naughty Dog, technical artists are half programmer, half artist. We spent some of our skill points learning how to program. Stephen and I both have computer science degrees, but we also know what it takes to make great art. We know the academic side, the composition, color theory, stuff like that, but we also know the tools and workflow needed to make the actual assets that go into the game.
In this talk, we'll go over some of the specific rendering techniques used in The Last of Us Part 2, as well as how the tech art team grew and leveled up throughout the course of the production.
Let's get started. And let's start at the beginning. Coming off of Uncharted 4, we felt we had achieved a huge milestone in rendering, and we're proud of the contributions of the tech art team. If you haven't seen our talk from SIGGRAPH 2016, definitely check it out. But pre-production and concept work on The Last of Us Part 2 was showing we'd have a very different problem to solve. Most of the game would be ambiently lit, which is an extremely hard look to achieve. The game would be full of glass, rain, and lots of other tricky surfaces, with a greater variety of environments than we had ever attempted. And the attention to detail was insane. Early rendering tests of our characters showed just how far we had to go. To achieve all of this, we had to upgrade not just our tech, but the way the tech art team works. We'll present a few features we developed in rough chronological order of implementation so you can see how things build upon each other. Stephen didn't join the studio till midway through production, so he'll mostly be speaking in the latter half of this presentation. Let's start by looking at the Naughty Dog Uber shader. This is one of the main tools that's primarily owned by the tech art team, and it'll give context for the rest of the talk. The Uber shader drives nearly every surface in the game. The only exceptions are the sky, water, and particles. The shader is about 48,000 lines of code, which doesn't include any of the generated code we have. The Uber shader is also the first thing we tackled on the project. We were cleaning up old messy interfaces, refactoring the code to be a stronger base to build upon. As a way of example, let's break down the material that we see here on the floor so you can see from an artist's perspective how does the Uber shader work. It's built up layer by layer, so this is our concrete base layer, some linoleum, a wetness layer, dirt, and all of these layers are inherited. These are single layer materials that were used somewhere else in the level, and the artist composited them together into this single multi-layered material. So what does the interface look like for this material? Well, first we have the layers panel where we see each layer in a stack, much like Photoshop layers. Layers that have a blue border in this interface are inherited from another material, and in the case of this ground material, you can see that's almost all of them. Next, we have the features panel, where the artist controls what's turned on for that layer. Here we're looking at the leaves layer, which uses a mix of some basic and some advanced controls. And at the top, notice we have different tabs which control each aspect of the layer's behavior. Let's look at what goes into the BRDF. What we see here is a representation of the main parameters, many of which are common in the industry, but a few of which are unique to our renderer. Down at the bottom, height map and fuzz in particular aren't exactly standard. Of course, this doesn't include other things that are in the GBuffer, like lighting data, motion vectors. We also have a bunch of special case parameters, like skin and hair. Our programmer Rami discussed this in depth at SIGGRAPH 2016, so check out his talk if you want to see more. Our overall concept of GBuffer packing and deferred permutations hasn't really changed, but we have tweaked these GBuffer channels considerably. So the main concept of each layer is a set of BRDF parameters. These are enabled as needed by the artist. The interface for each parameter is as simple as we can make it, and we have a few of the most common operations and adjustments built in, but we try not to go too crazy with that. We have a few special parameters like wetness that are accumulated independently throughout the layers, and then the results of this wetness modify the final BRDF values before writing them to the GBuffer. We have lots of other advanced parameters available, but if they're for a special case or something more advanced, we try to hide them in a submenu so that we don't clutter up the main view. It's good for both discovery by new artists and it allows advanced artists to have greater capabilities. We also have shader packages for more complicated things like fabric, skin, snow, and dozens of other elements. A shader package, as we call it, isn't anything magical. It's just a pre-packaged set of controls for a more complicated feature setup, usually something that affects multiple BRDF parameters or is driven by gameplay or something like that. The character dirt package, for example, affects color, normal, and roughness, and it has all the necessary code for being driven dynamically by events in gameplay. So that's everything that you can do within one layer. Now let's look at how artists can blend layers together. In this example, we have a layer that's solid red on top of a layer that's 50% gray. If the artist turns on a blend mode that's blending based on vertex color, you can see it just simply blends one layer against the next. We have other common blending operations like being able to blend based on a texture, a few slightly more advanced ones like a slope blend where the artist can blend based on vertex normal in world space. And we have quite a few adjustments that the artist can apply to increase contrast or softness or anything else they would need to do to that final blend result, or the blend result at intermediate steps in the pipeline. We also have a few meta features. In this example, we've added a new layer at the top of the stack that's got filled with a solid green color, and the blend mode is a polka dot texture. We can add this new meta feature called blend mode previous. What this does is it takes the final blend result from the previous layer and applies it to this layer as well, modulating the results together. This is great for things like inheritance, where artists may want to constrict one layer to what was happening in the previous one, but they don't want to spend all the work of recreating a complicated blend from one layer to the next. Another one of these meta features we have that's worth mentioning is using the height map from all the layers below this accumulated, but we'll get into that in a little bit more detail later. Our concept of UV streams is similarly rich. You can see here that throughout the scene we've got a variety of different UV tilings, and the water in particular has a constant flow to it. We allow for mundane operations like selecting the UV set in standard transforms. UV streams aren't inherently tied to a layer. The artist can choose which stream is used for each layer, or reuse a single stream everywhere. We also have more complicated features like parallax occlusion mapping, distortion, and animation. Quite a few others, both unique to our gameplay and just general case special effects. As an example of one of the more complicated features, years ago, our programmer Carlos developed a technique called flow. The UVs scroll constantly, but crossfade between two phase-shifted texture samples. This prevents it from stretching to infinity as the UVs increase. We took this concept and we integrated it fully throughout our entire UberShader architecture. Literally every texture sampler on every tab is capable of operating in this multi-sampled, phase-shifted mode. We have no special setup needed by the artist, or if a tech artist wants to add a new sampler, it's all already handled in the pipeline. It's 100% standard and compatible. And there are dozens of other details and optimizations like this invisible to the artist. For example, any of the UV animation controls automatically write correct motion vectors. One thing worth mentioning at this point, a little bit more high level, this does mean we have an explosion of permutations of the Uber shader. Every time an artist turns on a new feature, it generates a new shader binary. And the artists do have to eat the cost of this on the CPU and in level memory. The programming team did a great job with optimizations like deduplication of shader binaries for passes like depth and shadow, but the GBuffer pass basically has one unique shader binary per material. Despite the significant added optimization time we have to put into this, we feel that this diversity is critical to our look. We also have dozens of special case features, like border blend, which lives on the BRDF tab, that make common operations easier. So in this example, here's an image without it, and here's with. You can see, especially with inheritance, it's common to bring in one material over another, and we almost always want to do something in that transition range. In this case, the painted plaster has kind of like a more exposed, grimy, wet look in between. And this border blend feature encapsulates all of that functionality that artists want. We do try to keep our feature simple, and the border blend feature started that way. But ultimately, this is one of the most used shader packages in the game, and artists were okay with having a more complicated interface, especially since it allows them to easily create materials like the cracked linoleum layer we saw earlier. We literally, in between these two layers, in this border blend feature, we're sampling a completely different texture and applying it in that transition zone, which is critical to the look. Our decals can also make smart use of this system. Here's an example of a wall with and without a decal. The GBuffer is unpacked as a virtual layer at the bottom of the layer stack for the decal. This allows the artist to use literally any of our blending operations against those GBuffer channels of the surface below. This makes our decals highly reusable across many surfaces and reactive to the surface that they cover. We'll see again later how this works, but we can use height maps from the surface below to allow for an even more rich blend. So that kind of wraps up the high-level stuff we did for the Uber shader. How did we do? Even though the Uber shader was established on Uncharted 4, we took the opportunity to really improve and standardize the tech. By focusing on small, reusable modules, we were able to develop an incredibly rich shader that's easy for the artist to use. A clean codebase meant that the material was well optimized and easily extensible. We were off to a good start. But a bigger problem was becoming clear. I'm not proud to admit, but the programming team was frustrated by the tech art team. We had developed some unhealthy habits. Most significantly, tech art became a wall between the programming team and the art team. The programmers felt like a service department, not partners with the artists. They'd missed the creative collaboration. They felt detached from the game and felt they weren't recognized for their work. It took a while, but we put together a plan to get back on the right track. We looked for ways for the tech art team to act as a bridge rather than a wall. We searched for ways to develop healthy collaboration on complicated systems. And we wanted to prove our worth. This was something that the programmers specifically called out. If we could elevate our coding standards, maybe not all the way to where the programmers were, but so that they felt confident in our work, that would buy a lot of respect for the tech art team. So we agreed to this goal, not just for the good of the project, but for the good of our relationship. But we had a lot of work to do. So let's dive back into specific tech, and we'll use that as an example of how we grew. The next major piece of tech we embarked on was a deeper integration of height maps into our pipeline. And besides the final tech, this was a test of those new standards we wanted to set for ourselves. We've been using height maps since Uncharted 1 as blend masks, but we saw a lot more potential use for them throughout the pipeline. I spent a long time designing the interface, keeping it as simple and regular as possible. All scales are in centimeters, with a maximum range of plus or minus 10 centimeters, where a grayscale value of 0.5 in the source texture just means a neutral height. It was something that artists felt very familiar. These controls allow the artist to easily create effects where a surface is raised up, like the example we saw earlier, plaster over brick, or inset, like cracks cutting down into asphalt. It also allows artists to offset layers up and down, which is really important for versatility when dealing with inheritance. It took a lot of iteration and testing with the artist, but this initial implementation remained unchanged throughout the project. Doesn't mean iteration is bad, but it is worth putting in the time. So what can we use this for, now that it's integrated throughout the pipeline? Well, screen space ambient occlusion was one of the obvious cases. Here we see an example where it's using just the depth buffer and normals. Here's depth normals and height map. Go back and forth a couple times. This is just a flat plane. We could have baked that extra ambient occlusion into the texture, but it is reactive to the layer blends, and if another piece of geometry intersects with this surface, it'll interact properly. Screen space shadows were another example where this worked well. Here's without and with, and you can see the bricks and the window glass both cast a small contact shadow, which adds depth and believability to the surface. In reality, these two effects didn't register that well throughout most of the game. They were usually very subtle, but because it was integrated through the pipeline, it was almost free. But hopefully on our next generation tech, we'll be able to afford more samples and it'll read more clearly. And thank you to our programmer Hawar, who did the final implementation of both integration through the pipeline and these two effects. But we had a couple other cases where height maps worked exceptionally well. Decals, and in particular gameplay-based ones like blood decals, use the height map from the surface below. This allows them to integrate more dynamically with the world. In this example, the blood pool integrates with the carpet weave and avoids the fallen surface debris like plaster from the ceiling tiles. But that same blood pool would integrate equally well with floorboards, tiles, asphalt, these raised tiles with the circular bumps on them, or any other surface. And it was simple for the VFX team to tie into the height map buffer and make good use of this. I also explored lots of options for generating normal maps from the resulting height map in real time. The core calculation is really easy, ddx, ddy, and a cross product, but it inherently suffers from faceting of the polygons and of the pixels. There's no getting around it, it's just inherent to the math. But our main need for this was the one, for generating normals from height maps, was the one place we couldn't pre-bake the normals, and that was the dynamically generated blend region between layers, which we can control with the border blend feature. So we built the functionality into that. And as you can see here, it gives a massive benefit to the look of the surface. We found that the high frequency noise of the blend region sufficiently covers those pixelation artifacts. So our team was able to use this tech extensively despite its limitations. And here's the code that we used to generate world space normals from that height map buffer. Note that the blend mask parameter represents the region between layers, so we only get the normals where we want them. So how did we do? The artist interface, overall design of the system, and specific use cases like decals were a huge success. I did a lot of prototyping ahead of time for the screen space shadows implementation that Hawar ultimately finished up. I got accurate results, but a really optimized implementation is both really hard math and really hard programming, and I wasn't up to the challenge. I had good intentions, but I should have agreed with programmers early that this was just a proof of concept. It would have allowed us to do the prototype much more quickly, and I could have written it in a way that isolated it from the rest of the code. Furthermore, I was getting on the programmer's nerves by constantly asking questions. Almost every single line of code I needed to ask for help with, and they felt I was better off just kind of either doing it myself or handing it off to them. But as I mentioned before, Hawar took over the final implementation and did a fantastic job, and the results are great. We just could have gotten there with a lot less friction. Let's look at another set of features surrounding wetness. The tech art team and myself were still kind of in prove ourselves mode, so this was done without a lot of engineering input. I was actually kind of reacting to the height map situation and said, okay, I'll do it all myself. In the long run, it's not a healthy way to work, but it was part of the growing pain that we went through. The basis of our wetness is the Uncharted 4 system, which I described in our 2016 SIGGRAPH talk. A single wetness parameter drives the progression from a surface being dry, to damp, to water clinging due to surface tension, all the way to a standing water puddle, and it affects all BRDF parameters. But The Last of Us Part 2 has a lot of rain and a lot of wet surfaces. Our initial tech push, where we developed most of this, was for the Paris Game Show trailer, starting with the characters. To keep things flexible, we decided that the artist should only have to author a wetness mask, and we would derive all of the needed data off of that. In the past, artists would author a wetness mask and a matching normal map, but it was hard to animate those two things together. So I added a new feature called Specular Normal. Here we see the standard diffuse normal and the results of applying a specular normal on top of that. By default, normal maps are applied to the full lighting solution, but when this feature is enabled, we activate a different deferred permutation and a different configuration of the GBuffer, where we have the separate normals for specular lighting and for diffuse lighting. Both of these normals are used correctly throughout the pipeline. For example, the subsurface pass reads only the diffuse normal, while the IBL pass reads only the specular normal. And the final deferred shaders read both. In the case of water on skin, I apply a threshold to that wetness mask and set it to the appropriate scale for a height map, that real world plus or minus 10 centimeters units, and then we generate specular normals from that using the technique described earlier. So here's what the wetness mask looks like when it's animating. The animation is the same kind of trick we've been doing for years, where the artist authors a static mask painting where they want the rivulets of water to flow, and then we have a scrolling cloud texture which is overlaid on top of that mask, crossfading using the flow technique we described earlier. Here's the specular normal it generates. You can see in some areas it's slightly more subtle, but for example on the neck, it has a pretty pronounced effect. And the final result in-game. Finally, let's talk about the lighting of the water droplets. First, we can see the results of having a separate specular versus diffuse normal. If the normal map was shared, the drips would look like veins rather than simply a specular highlight that's a little bit different. We also do a simulated caustic refraction and shadowing. This glass hemisphere illustrates the effect. The light collects at the highlight point and then falls into a cast shadow on the opposite side of the hemisphere. So what does that look like? In theory, we can assume that this is a perfect cross-section of a water droplet or rivulet. We have the normal of the rendered pixel and its height. There's the height, which comes from our wetness mask. And we can use that to sort of construct a mathematical model of a virtual droplet. Since we only have knowledge of the current pixel, not neighboring pixels, we have to reverse project how this is going to come together. And we get our final refracted light ray with full knowledge of what should be a highlight and shadow. The code for that looks like this. Well, actually it kind of just looks like this. It's a giant hack. But at least it's a hack that's modeling a real-world phenomenon as faithfully as possible based on the reference we could gather and shoot for ourselves. The results were pretty successful, and then we generalized the controls and applied it to all kinds of surfaces: ground, cars, glass, basically everything in the game. Even our puddles have been upgraded. We use a separate diffuse normal for the surface underneath and a specular normal for that flat or rippled water surface. And there's a subtle but perceptible difference here. There's a lot of other cool tech we put into our wetness and rain. Our programmer, Artem Kovalovs, is presenting at SIGGRAPH 2020 this year, GPU-driven effects of The Last of Us Part 2. Check it out, there's some really cool stuff. So how did we do? Well, other than the hacky Caustics tech, this was actually written pretty cleanly. We reused the existing height map tech to really good effect, and the features are designed with artist usability at the forefront. The specular normal system is implemented efficiently, and it's highly extensible, as we saw with the puddles. We'll have even more examples of how we use it in later sections. Before we go on to another feature, let's pause for a moment and talk outside of that. How do we know when a rendering technique is right? The goal in any physically based renderer is to match reality as closely as possible, even if we know we can never quite get there. Having an expensive ground truth mode in your renderer is very useful, but when possible, it's also useful to match your rendering conditions against reality. For example, many of our characters are a direct scan of real people. As in this example, our character Abby in-game, as you can see on the left half of the image, and her model on the right. This allows us to craft a camera and lighting scenario in the real world that we can match exactly in our engine. You can see here that we measured the camera distance and height and the light intensities, their exact angles and heights. And this was invaluable for validating that our artwork, our shader, our BRDF, and our renderer were all giving the results we wanted, and it helped us focus our energy on the elements that were most significantly wrong. You can measure how correct a solution is by measuring the difference in energy versus a ground truth, either positive or negative, and varying based on incident angle of the camera, light source, and local geometry. In practice, we don't spit out any quantitative measurements. It's not like we have a tool to measure the difference, but by looking at the image, it's a constant topic of conversation, and it's a clear goal. One thing to look out for, though: beware of discontinuities, either spatial or temporal. A common example of this is when screen space reflections, which are arguably pretty correct, when they don't match up with the cube maps that they fall back to, it really draws a lot of attention. Hard edges and localized areas of contrast create mini focal points. It's like a mosquito buzzing in the player's ear. They steal attention away from what's actually important about the scene. So it is worth fighting to avoid artifacts of all sorts, even if that means a rendering solution is slightly less correct in the ideal case. Alright, back to feature development. Next, it was time to rework our eye shader. We'd already shown a few close-ups in our reveal trailer, but we wanted something with a lot more life. Here are Ellie's eyes from that reveal trailer. A lot of craft went into this, but in the end they look a little bit cartoony, and they really only look good in certain lighting scenarios and camera angles. Our final implementation is a lot more dynamic and lifelike. Before we dive into details, one implementation note: in our engine, eyes are forward rendered, but still write to the GBuffers. Full screen passes like subsurface, IBL, and post-process effects operate on that data. Then a final forward pass reads from those buffers and calculates final lighting. That forward pass is incredibly expensive. It's the most expensive shader in the game. But due to the small size on screen, eyes have very little frame rate impact. So we started by doing some research. Of course, next generation character rendering by Jorge Jimenez is a fantastic place to start. And we also did our own photo shoot. It's worth noting, there's plenty of eye reference online, but I can't stress enough: do your own photo shoot. Not just for eyes, but when analyzing any physical phenomenon, careful measurement and observation is really critical to understanding the effect. Act like a scientist. Come up with a hypothesis. Make a guess as to what you think is going to happen. Set up a test and measure the result. If the results match your expectations, great. But more likely than not, there will be subtleties that you weren't expecting and that will emerge. And those subtleties are how we advance the craft. So, after reading the paper and doing our own research, I broke eye shading down into all the micro features that add together to make up the final result, and started implementing them one by one. Most of these features I pretty much just implemented straight from Jorge's paper. So in this talk, we'll present just the places where our implementation differs or improves on his team's techniques. The first big improvement we made was screen space shadows from the eyelids and eyelashes. Here's what that looks like. This is a brute force method compared to our global implementation that Hawar did. It has a hard-coded ray march distance and samples our opaque plus alpha depth buffer. So here's what the buffer looks like. Here's that opaque plus alpha depth buffer, and that gets us shadows from the eyelashes. I found that this approach was much more reliable than what's common in the industry, which is like an animated plane or lookup texture. This captures subtle differences in eyelid shape and even brow positions, for example, this shot of Joel. And even in a close-up shot like this, the GPU cost for the entire eye shader is sub-millisecond. We take this idea of ray march screen space shadows and apply it to generate an IBL occlusion term as well. But instead of a vector to a light, we apply it along the camera reflection vector. For the diffuse component, we use standard screen space ambient occlusion. We just pull from the existing buffer. So that's it for shadowing. Let's talk about caustics. Caustic light refraction is an ad hoc function, but as we've been talking, it's tuned to match our reference as closely as possible. We use our diffuse normal buffer to light the inner surface of the iris and to apply subsurface scattering. And then we use our specular normal for the outer surface of the cornea. And that way systems like IBL reflections don't need any special knowledge of the eye shader. They just process what's in the GBuffers and spit out the result. The implementation for this caustic effect, which is in that subsurface pass, is straight up hacky. However, by breaking the rendering down into extremely granular real-world phenomena, even this hack can be measured for correctness and tuned independently of all of the other elements. So here's what she looks like in a couple different lighting scenarios and camera angles, and it holds up pretty well to our reference. And here's the code. Do not steal this, please. Do yourself a favor, get a programmer to help. Next, let's look at the Limbus. This is the dark ring around the iris. It's common to just paint this into the diffuse texture, but it's not actually part of the color of the eye. It's a result of the cornea refracting and focusing the light away from the leading edge. In our photo reference, in the upper image, you can see that it's almost completely missing when the light shines directly at the subject, but is very pronounced when the light comes in at a glancing angle. We give the character artist control over the Limbus intensity because it does vary a lot from person to person. To apply this Limbus to ambient lighting, we do a brute force calculation of the Limbus intensity at 8 points on the hemisphere. We essentially simulate 8 light directions, and then we average the result. Again, we know that the cost of the eyes is very small because of their small size on screen, and this ensures that those artistic controls give consistent visual results for all different types of lights. We could have went further and applied it directly to the spherical harmonics lookup, but the subtlety that bought us wasn't worth it. And as with the Caustics, this implementation is very ad hoc, but by isolating individual phenomena, tuned against reference, it can be measured for correctness. Again, please don't copy this. Next, let's look at the tier line. This is less of like simulating what energy does, and it's a practical solution to a practical problem. We achieve our tier line by using a GBuffer decal. It's geometry that is essentially attached to the eyelid and animated along with it. What we do is a literal blurred multi-sample of the GBuffer, and then we blend in a lumpy water normal and write the results back to the GBuffer. The main effect comes from blending the normal channel, but this also does get applied to color, roughness, and specular as well. So at that point, all of our systems were in place, and I was doing final tuning of the shader with the artist. We noticed at a grazing angle, we weren't getting enough subsurface energy in the sclera. That's the white part of the eye. As you can see in the image here, there's just like kind of a little ring of light in the sclera. So to fix this, we looked at, is there some mistake in our code? But it turned out we needed to adjust that diffuse normal map that's used by the subsurface pass. Because we had it as a convex surface, it needed to be concave. And we believe that this is a physically plausible solution to the problem, not a hack. And it's something we wouldn't have noticed if we hadn't shot our own reference. So what's next? Well, we also applied a lot of our custom eye shader tech to teeth, which are also forward rendered. And this was based on an idea from our friend James Answer at London Studio. And most notably, this introduces the screen space shadows, but also custom subsurface scattering tuned with a smaller radius and some like special hacks to make sure that light from the lips doesn't bleed onto the teeth. And you can spot some other tricks too, like that micro wetness normal that was presented in the Jimenez paper. Overall, it gives great results. So how did we do? The initial research, both the prior art and the photo reference, was extremely valuable and gave us a clear implementation roadmap, feature by feature. The new eye shader gives great results, and the code is robust. Big picture, the tech art team had solidified our tech footing, and we were delivering good work. But we weren't getting in the programmer's way, but we weren't really collaborating either. But it was still progress. But then we got hit by another curveball. Our other technical art director, Andrew Maximov, left to form his own company. Good luck, Andrew. So I took over a lot of his responsibilities, which were more on the tools and pipeline side, which could be a whole other talk. and we hired Steve and Tang to help keep our shader development moving forward.
Hello there.
For the first few months that Steven worked at the studio, we did constant code reviews, bringing him up to the standard we had reached for code quality and research. We had a moment in the game where we wanted some taxidermied wolves to have retro-reflective eyes, like many nocturnal animals do. And yes, good taxidermists include this effect as well. The eye shader for humans was pretty much good to go, so we asked Steven to add the retro-reflective eye tech. Take it away, Steven.
As Waylon said, in some parts of our game, for example in this museum space, we want animal eyes to be glowing under strong light to give this creepy feel. Now, the immediately obvious approach would be to add an emissive component to the eyes, maybe with a Fresnel and tie it to the flashlight intensity. But that's very hacky, and how can we do better? We did some quick research on the science behind these glowing eyes. It turns out that some animals, such as wolves or cats, have an extra reflective layer behind their retina. This layer is called
tapetum lucidum.
What this layer does is that it reflects the light back the way it comes, so the light passes through the retina twice, which grants better vision in darker environments. So really, what we are seeing as the glowing eye effect is just the specular response of this
tapetum lucidum.
Now that understanding has brought us to a very simple implementation. We added a specular component using light direction as normal. We masked it by the iris and tuned it against references. There's also an iridescence effect achieved using our thin film interference function, which we'll expand on later. The team liked the creepy feeling these glowing eyes give, so we eventually propagated this to all the infected enemies as well.
We ended up making subtle tweaks to the eye shader till the end of the project. For example, the caustics weren't strong enough on dark brown irises, but the core tech held till the end. But we can cross this one off the list for real now. Next, let's talk about glass. There is a lot of glass in The Last of Us Part 2 in all different forms. In this section, we'll cover some of the elements that make up the tech and how we made them modular and reusable enough to drive everything that we need in the game. We have 4 core techniques for rendering glass. The first 2 are a refinement of techniques that are used in Uncharted 4 and common in the industry. We have pre-multiplied alpha, where the specular component is always 100% present, and the diffuse opacity is what's variable, in the case of grime or paint on glass, stuff like that. We also do a screen refraction technique, where we sample a distorted version of the screen buffer using distorted UV position based on the properties of the glass, which is good for things like glass bottles. For The Last of Us Part 2, we also implemented 2 new techniques. We implemented a blurry refraction, which is a temporally jittered multisampling of the screen buffer within a cone that's defined by the roughness of the glass surface. And our programmer Ke implemented that one for us. And we have a lot of buildings with a lot of interiors, and that was going to be a huge cost. So we developed a bunch of techniques that together allow us to fake these interiors based on a single quad. Let's look at those fake interiors first. So this image is going to illustrate what's included in that fake interior material. Everything that I've highlighted in green here is just a quad. That's it. The blinds, the room behind, the glass, and the broken sections of the glass, all of that is just part of the same shader. And here's what that looks like in motion. Note the variation in the world, both in terms of the interiors and that outer surface of the plane. The grime and cracked windows add believability and interest. The parallaxing blinds add an immediate layer of depth, 5 or 10 centimeters behind the glass. And then we use cube maps to represent the interiors, taking inspiration from the technique called interior mapping by Joost van Dongen. And this makes use of all of our other new techniques as well. Screen space shadows give cast shadows from the cracked glass, and we have a separate specular normal for the glass surface versus a diffuse normal for the blinds underneath. It's not as good as doing 2 full lighting passes, but it's certainly cheaper, and it's certainly better than just using a single normal for both of those. Let's look a little bit more at those Cubemap interiors. To generate the cube maps, our artists model out actual scenes in our engine, and the layers light them with a neutral white light coming through a fake aperture like a window. We then use our standard Cubemap capture pipeline to generate these images. The algorithm for the projection is really similar to the standard box projection that we do for IBL Cubemap Lighting, the way we place cube maps in the world. But we wanted this to be as user-friendly as possible, so the projection is totally based on the UVs of the geometry. This allows a ton of versatility for the artist in the placement and scaling of that interior, and by attaching it to the geometry rather than in the shader, it allows them a ton of variation throughout the scene. Here's the code to generate that XYZ lookup vector. I feel like this is actually pretty good code and might be worth stealing. There's definitely some optimizations to be done in here because I simplified it for readability. Now, the way we do these windows, they are deferred rendered, so they're about as cheap as I can get. That cube map, to get the right amount of energy in it, we multiply the cube map by the baked ambient lighting that's on the surface of the window, that's baked into the surface of that quad, so that the energy of that material doesn't need to be tweaked as lighting changes throughout the scene or across multiple scenes. Then we essentially do a pre-multiplied alpha technique to blend, here you can see the diffuse base color against the energy of the cube map. The cube map is packed into the emissive channel of the GBuffer. Finally, we set our ambient occlusion to 0 for any areas where the glass should be totally broken out. This is a special case in our deferred renderer, and a hint not to do any specular reflection for those areas. Everything else goes through the render pipeline in a completely standard way. The roughness, specular, and diffuse normals of the surface of the glass are nothing special. It's just grime like on any other surface. But what fun is a window if you can't break it? It would have been really easy to do spiderweb crack decals like we've done in previous games, but we wanted something more dynamic. We have a buffer called our material modification buffer. This operates in screen space. It's calculated shortly after the depth buffer, but before the GBuffer pass is rendered. When the player shoots a window, we spawn a particle that projects onto the surface in this special pass. Later, when we run the GBuffer pass, we read from this buffer to decide where the glass should be cracked. So as you can see, this is kind of like a low frequency buffer. It doesn't have all that tiny little detail. We also have other low frequency sources, like the artist can paint a vertex color where they want the windows to be pre-broken, or even have some world space randomness. We take that low frequency result, combine it together, and then apply the high frequency detail in the areas masked by the low frequency. We did develop this material modification buffer back on Uncharted 4, thanks to our programmer Dylan Barry, but we extended its use significantly for The Last of Us Part 2. Now in most levels, these fake interior effects are really subtle, and we can use them extremely close to the playable space as long as it's outside of melee range of the player. I'll hand it back to Steven now.
Next, let's take a look at the rainy glass effect in our game. What you see on screen here is a good example of that effect. And here's a close-up example. The parameters are tuned differently from the previous one, but the techniques used are the same in both examples. There are a few key components to this effect. Let's break it down. The first is of course screen space refraction. As mentioned before, this is an old tech from Uncharted 4. This gives us the basic static water droplet look. Next is the blurred refraction. This is a new tech implemented for The Last of Us Part 2. It is perfect for the foggy glass look. And to finish it off, we add some animated ring streaks. These are implemented as a special shader package. It modifies both the refraction normal and blurriness. We will expand on this in the next slide. We use a special texture for the animated droplets shader package. In the red channel, there are the ring streaks, which sets the refraction blurriness to 0 and masks away the static droplets. In the green channel, we have the big droplets that are leading the ring streaks, which also sets refraction blurriness to 0 and modifies the refraction normal. Both the red and green channels are animated by scrolling in the UV space V direction. In the blue channel, we have these small static droplets that the ring streaks leave behind. These do not animate, but they're masked by the ring streaks in the red channel. And finally, in the alpha channel, we have an ID mask. We use this ID mask to vary the timing for the animation. We have 4 different versions of this texture. These 4 textures are stacked on top of each other to get a good coverage of a surface and to provide variation so we do not see the obvious repeating patterns. let's take a look at how the masks animate. First, we have a very simple scroll in the V direction. Then we randomize the speed using the ID mask. And we add a time variance. And finally, we add the horizontal noise to make it look like ring streaks. To expand a little on time variance, we do not want the droplets to travel at uniform speed, so we added a noise to the time using a monotonically increasing sine wave noise. Here's the code for that. Next, let's take a look at the fake thickness effect we have for the cracked glass. Our implementation to the glass thickness effect is relatively cheap and easy to make for the artists. We use this special glass ID mask texture to determine which pixel is a cross-section pixel. This texture can easily be created in Substance Designer using the fluff fill function or any other similar program. We sample this texture twice using a simple parallax offset, and if the two samples have different values, we know that the view vector passes through a cross-section. Once we've determined that a pixel contains a cross-section, there are two main components to the shading, the normal map and the environmental cube map. First, we dilate the normal map of the crack texture to make this cross-section normal. This is applied to the glass as the diffuse normal. The specular normal of the glass remains unchanged, so the surface of the glass remains continuous, but you also get a hint of lighting of the cross-section from this diffuse normal. To finish off the effect, we sample the environment cube map using the diffuse normal and apply it as a emissive component to the glass to fake the internal reflections. The last interesting thing I want to talk about for the glass is the thin film interference. Here is a before and after comparison. This is before, and this is after. Before, after. The effect is quite subtle, but you can definitely see a visual difference. This effect is often seen on glasses or camera lens, where the UV coating or anti-glare coating on the glass forms a thin film, which creates a iridescent specular. Here is a real-world example. You can see the green-purple hues in the highlights on the glass, despite the light source being a slightly warm white color. Now, thin film interference as a physical phenomena has been pretty well researched and documented. I won't go too deep into the details here, but just a brief idea of how it works. If you look at this diagram here, when light hits a surface with a thin film on it, part of the light reflects off of the top of the film, and part of it is refracted into the film, then reflected off of the bottom of the film. These two light rays travel slightly different distances, which creates a phase offset between the light rays, causing them to interfere differently depending on the angle and the thickness of the film. The effect is implemented as an additional step after the regular specular calculation. Here is the simplified code.
One thing that's important to note is that the interface is consistent for all of these special features for all of the different types of glass, as well as other alpha-blended surfaces like foliage and hair. Furthermore, this all fits within our layered material framework. We have a few shader packages that bundle common functionality, like the breakable glass, but artists are free to layer grime, wetness, spray paint, or anything else they need using the standard modular interface. So that's the high-level overview and a lot of details, a lot of artistic freedom while standardizing some of the most complicated setups. But all of these surface features wouldn't be possible without the graphics programmers solving some of the really hard problems. Thanks to Ka for implementing the blurry refraction for us, Hawar for multi-layered refraction techniques, and Artem and Stephen Marandino for glass interacting with water. It was a really successful collaboration between the programming team and the tech art team, partially because of the work that we did together, but also because the tech art team knew when to step aside, and we made room for the programmers to work directly with the art team as needed. This was a long journey to get to this point, both in terms of tech and in our relationship, but it was well worth the effort. Let's look at one last feature, which was a true cross-discipline collaboration between tech art, programming, and VFX.
There's a lot that goes into snow rendering, but today we're mostly going to talk about the deformation. I'll start with the core systems our graphics programmers implemented as a foundation for the deformation, and then expand on how the tech art team worked on top of this foundation to create the final effect. The first part of the system is the particle render target implemented by Artem Kovalovs, our graphics programmer. For each piece of mesh of deformable snow, we assign it to a particle render target. In the screenshot here, you can see the rectangular regions that are mapped to the render targets, and the lines that connect the mesh to each region. In each frame, we do a mesh raycast from the character knees to a little bit below their feet. If the cast hits a snow surface, we draw a footprint particle into the particle render target. This is what the render target looks like. This render target can then be used as a texture input in the snow shader to create the deformation. Now we know where to deform, the actual deformation in our shader is implemented using a parallax occlusion mapping. This is done by our graphics programmer Vincent Markson, working with Artem and a couple of other graphics programmers. This is what the snow looks like with just the parallax occlusion mapping. In the shader, we sample the particle render target texture, map it to world space, then use a standard parallax occlusion mapping to get the basic deformation. However, in order to get the correct intersection shape, we also need the parallax occlusion mapping to output the correct depth after the deformation. We do this by calculating the world position after the deformation, converting that to screen space depth, and outputting it into the depth buffer using a special custom depth pixel shader before the GBuffer pass. And next is where the TechArt team comes in. We first construct the normal of the deformation using the particle render target. The algorithm is the same as the derivative normal we've talked about before using ddx and ddy. It's just this time, instead of in screen space, we do it in a particle render target space. By spreading the samples further apart, we can easily soften the normal to avoid the faceting artifacts. The next step is to depress the undeformed snow to create a raised edge around the deformation. The particles we write into the particle render targets are in cone shapes, so naturally the deformation would look like this. We remap this using this quadratic function, flip it around and mirror the shape, and we get nice and smooth raised edges around the deformation. Here are the screenshots for comparison again. We then add some detail normals around the deformation using the particle render target as a mask. The last step is adding some drop shadow for the deformation, again using the same particle render target. Since the parallax effect is only applied in the GBuffer pass as well as the custom depth pass, when sunlight is casting shadow, what it's seeing is really the undeformed snow. So to get the correct shadowing behavior, we ended up turning off the shadow casting for the snow geometry altogether, and added a fake shadow using parallax projection based on the sun direction. Yes, this only works for the sun, but we only really have that one use case. Remember the blood pool height map interaction we talked about before? For the deformable snow, we set the height map value in the deformation accordingly, so blood pools only appear inside the deformation. Overall, this systemic render target approach allows us to get creative with relatively little effort. We can do many cool effects, such as the deformation revealing the mud beneath the snow, characters leaving tracks in the mud when they slide on the ramps, or this cool blood melting snow effect. As our effects lead Eben Cook once said, it is all systemic, so we get things like this for free. Now of course this isn't really for free, there's a lot of artist effort that went into the effects, but this approach made it possible and painless for the artists.
And that is how we want to work. So what's next? This is going to be a really interesting generation leap. This is the first time that many of our techniques are actually correct and can be carried over without rewriting. This will leave us to focus on missing details, both in terms of geometry, textures, and in the rendering. Even in this side-by-side image, there are major elements missing, like peach fuzz, localized light bounce, and hair detail. There are also a few things that are present but wrong, like poor detail and specular response. But that's not a bad place to be. If we continue to fight for correctness and reusability, and for healthy collaboration, the next generation of consoles and PCs should yield a massive improvement in quality. Hopefully you found it useful seeing these examples of our work. Looking back, there were a few common philosophies that made our work successful. First, recreate physical phenomena. Don't just layer hacks. Do your own research and try to base things on reality as much as possible. If possible, if there's a real formula that you can implement, do so, like, for example, Snell's law for refraction. If that's not possible, like if the real formula is too expensive, make a ground truth and fit a cheaper function to it. If that's not possible, visually tune your algorithm against reference, but again, shoot your own reference. Don't make it up. Maybe this is an obvious one, but write good code. Think systemically and reusably. Don't just think about how you can solve the problem in front of your nose, but how you can create systems that build on and talk to each other in a reliable and extensible way. And make sure that the artist interface is as simple and powerful as possible. And it should go without saying, but make it performant. Finally, elevate the team. Don't have conversations instead of an artist, put them in touch with a programmer. Don't explain a programmer's feature to the art team, put the programmer in a position to explain it for themselves, and help everyone showcase their own work in the best way possible. Don't be a wall, be a bridge. So what's next for the tech art team? I guess I'd like to say Stephen and I are just a small part of the team, and shading is just one aspect of what we do. Across the studio, we have about 8 people who fall under the broad umbrella of tech art as full-time artists, and probably another dozen who do occasionally contribute code. Together, we drive frame rate and memory optimization, we develop standards and practices for art creation, and we write a ton of tools and script to make the artists' lives easier. Between us, we support 48,000 lines of shader code, as we saw earlier, but 500,000 lines of script code. And in all of these areas, we're pushing to become better. I'd like to thank the Naughty Dog graphics programming team for everything that they've done for us, for the guidance that they've given us over the years, for their patience while we go through this transition, and for the incredible engine that they've built for us. We really are just like adding that little bit of extra detail, and it would not be possible without such a solid engine and pipeline to build upon. I want to thank the tech art team in particular, some who helped contribute to some of our shader code but didn't present in this talk. A few members of our VFX team whose work was highlighted in these slides, and to the entire art team. Their ideas inspired so many of these features, and they are the ones who turn these into reality. But in particular, I'd like to thank Jared and Matthew, who contributed a lot of images to these slides, and their relationship with us and with the programmers contributed a ton to the tech. Finally, I'd like to thank the SIGGRAPH organizers for their patience while we get these presentations sorted out. Obligatory Naughty Dog is hiring slide, but I do want to say we have a lot of roles that are under the umbrella of tech art. So look for anything that looks like rendering TD, environment TD, character TD, anything like that to see if something speaks to you. Finally, check out our team's other talks at SIGGRAPH 2020, and we hope to see you in the Q&A. Thank you.